I used to work as an editor for a small newspaper in a bustling town in New Jersey. My department handled the obituary column, a task that often felt somber but was also an essential part of our community. One day, while I was typing up the latest entries, a man walked into the office looking visibly shaken. "Hey there," he said, approaching my desk. "I need to submit an obituary." I noticed the man had a strange urgency in his voice, so I gestured for him to sit down. He fished a photo out of his pocket and handed it to me. As I looked at the image, I was taken aback. It was a photo of him, grinning widely, yet his eyes seemed hollow. I looked up at him and asked, "Is this some kind of joke? This is your photo." "Yeah," he replied, his voice trembling. "Because I'm going to die tonight." I furrowed my brow, trying to process his words. "What do you mean you're going to die tonight? How do you know?" He leaned in closer, whispering as if he was afraid someone would overhear. "There's a ghost in my house. It told me it's coming for me tonight. If you don't believe me, come over and see for yourself." I was skeptical but intrigued. My connections in the community were solid, and I wasn't one to back down from a bizarre story. I shot back, "All right, give me your address and phone number. I'll swing by tonight." He scribbled down his details, and as I glanced at the address, I realized it was just a few blocks away. Later that evening, after finishing my work, I arrived at his house around 9 p.m. He opened the door, fear etched across his face, but the moment he saw me, a glimmer of relief washed over him. "Thank you for coming," he said, ushering me inside. He offered me a seat and went to make some tea. Just then, he paused and said, "Stay right there. I'll be back in a minute." As he stepped out of the room, the door creaked shut behind him. I was about to settle into the chair when suddenly it moved slightly, as if someone had just sat down. My heart raced. Then, out of nowhere, his phone rang. It was him calling from the other room. "Did the door just shut behind me?" he asked. I replied, "Yeah, it did. Whatever you do, don't sit in the big red chair. That's my chair. Just stay put, I'll be right back." The call ended abruptly, and my gut twisted. I looked over at the red chair, and it moved again, slightly backward then forward, like it was occupied. I couldn't believe my eyes. Feeling a surge of defiance, I grabbed a flower vase from the table and hurled it at the chair. To my shock, the vase halted midair and spun back toward me, slamming into my head with a painful thud. I staggered back, disoriented. Before I could process what just happened, I heard a loud bang from another room followed by desperate screams. I dashed toward the sound, and when I flung the door open, a rush of cold air blasted past me. Inside I saw him. The man was being thrown around the room, colliding with the walls as if some invisible force was tossing him like a rag doll. My heart raced, and I froze, horrified. Suddenly, I noticed the kitchen door was ajar, and it swung wide open, revealing the gas stove. The flame flickered ominously, and I realized it was on. His screams intensified as he was dragged toward it. I stood there, paralyzed by fear, watching as he struggled for breath, his voice turning to a gurgle. In one final desperate move, he grabbed a live wire and screamed, "Help me!" before collapsing, lifeless. I couldn't wrap my head around what I had just witnessed. My mind raced as I stumbled out of the house, trying to process the horror I'd seen. I knew I had to tell someone, but how could I explain it? A week later, another man came into my office, equally frantic. He handed me his photo and details for an obituary. My heart sank as I recognized him as the man's friend. I asked him how he knew he was dying, and he replied with the same eerie words, "There's a ghost in my house." I laughed nervously, dismissing him, but he left my office looking terrified. Just as he stepped outside, I heard a commotion. I ran to the window and saw a crowd gathered. A car had just struck him. Shocked, I received a call from my friend James shortly after. "Dude, have you seen Manny? He hasn't been himself lately. He's been holed up in his place, freaking out." I promised to check on him, and within minutes, I was at his apartment, where I found him trembling in a corner, mumbling about being hunted. "It's coming for me. Just like it got the others," he cried. I tried to reassure him, suggesting he calm down and have some tea, but as I was pouring, he suddenly bolted for the window. "I can't let it get me!" he shouted, and before I could react, he leaped from the 8th floor. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was caught in a twisted horror story. I had witnessed not one, but 2 deaths tied to the same chilling tale. From that day on, I was never the same. I couldn't help but wonder if there was something sinister lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. The events of that night had left an indelible mark on me, and my life was forever changed. The weight of those deaths burdened me, and the unsettling details of those final moments haunted my sleep. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen, searching for a logical explanation, but nothing fit. I was left with this unsettling truth: something supernatural had taken those lives, something I could barely comprehend. I started noticing patterns, a subtle shift in the way I viewed the world. The everyday occurrences that I had once overlooked, a creaking door, a sudden gust of cold air, a fleeting shadow, now felt charged with a hidden significance. I found solace in my work, immersing myself in the stories of the people who lived and died in my community. I became a meticulous chronicler of their lives, painstakingly documenting their achievements, their joys, and their sorrows. This became my way of coping, finding a sliver of peace amidst the unsettling reality I had embraced. But the events of that night continued to echo in my mind. I talked to my friend James, who encouraged me to seek professional help. But I was reluctant. I feared that talking about it would only magnify the terror, that it would confirm the presence of something I couldn't explain. I tried to bury myself in work, but the news was filled with reports of strange occurrences, unexplained deaths, and haunting incidents. The world seemed to be reflecting the darkness I had witnessed. I found myself constantly searching for connections, for patterns, for clues that might help me understand what I had seen. One evening, while working late at the office, I stumbled upon an old file, a collection of articles from the early 1900s about a series of unexplained deaths in our town. The reports detailed the strange circumstances surrounding the deaths of various individuals, their final moments marked by inexplicable tremors, sudden bouts of fear, and eerie warnings of impending doom. The details were eerily similar to the events I had witnessed. The same chilling sense of dread, the same inexplicable fear, the same terrifying premonitions. It was as if the whispers of a forgotten nightmare had resurfaced, echoing across the years. The more I read, the more I felt a knot of fear tighten in my chest. I realized that the events I had witnessed were not isolated. They were part of a recurring pattern that had plagued our town for generations. This was no mere coincidence, no trick of the mind. This was something ancient, something sinister, and something that had found its way back into our world. I began to explore these articles further, delving into the history of my small town, seeking answers in the hushed whispers and forgotten tales that had been tucked away in dusty archives. I discovered a dark secret that had long been buried, a legend that had been passed down through generations in hushed tones. It was a tale of a vengeful spirit, a malevolent entity that had been entangled with the fabric of our town since its founding. This spirit, known only as the Harbinger, was said to be fueled by a thirst for vengeance, seeking out unsuspecting victims, whispering warnings of their impending doom, and then driving them to their deaths. The legend spoke of the Harbinger's sinister power, its ability to manipulate the physical world, to induce feelings of terror, and to orchestrate events that led to the demise of its chosen targets. It was a legend that had been dismissed as mere superstition, a fading relic of a bygone era. But now, as I sat in my office surrounded by the ghosts of the past, I realized that the legend was not just a story. It was a chilling reality that I had stumbled upon. The Harbinger was not a figment of my imagination. It was a real force, a dark power that had returned, and it was claiming its victims once again. With this knowledge, I felt a newfound urgency. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about protecting my community, about exposing the truth and breaking the cycle of fear that had gripped our town for centuries. But how could I fight something that was so powerful, something that defied logic and reason? I realized that the only way to defeat the Harbinger was to understand it, to unravel its motivations, its history, and its weaknesses. I needed to delve deeper into the town's history, to uncover the secrets that had been buried for generations. I spent weeks researching, poring over crumbling documents, interviewing elderly residents who had witnessed the eerie occurrences firsthand, and piecing together the fragmented parts of the Harbinger's story. I discovered that the entity's origins were tied to a dark chapter in our town's history, a tragic event that had left a scar on our collective soul. It was a tale of betrayal, murder, and vengeful spirits. A prominent businessman, driven by avarice and greed, had orchestrated a scheme to acquire valuable land from a local family, a family that had been the backbone of our community for generations. During a heated dispute, the businessman had murdered the family patriarch, leaving his widow and children to face a future of despair and poverty. The heartbroken widow, consumed by rage and grief, had cursed the businessman, vowing that he would never find peace, that his soul would be forever haunted by the pain he had caused. In a moment of desperation, the heartbroken widow summoned a powerful entity, a dark force that promised to deliver retribution. And so, the Harbinger was born. It was bound to the businessman's soul, forever condemned to roam the town, seeking out victims, perpetuating the cycle of fear, and ensuring that the businessman's legacy would be one of terror and pain. The Harbinger's victims were not randomly chosen. They were individuals who, in some way, mirrored the businessman's transgressions. Each victim was a symbol of the darkness that had taken root in our town, a dark echo of the businessman's sin. With this knowledge, I started to see the events of that night in a new light. The men who had come to my office, seeking to submit their obituaries, were not just victims of a malevolent entity. They were individuals who had unknowingly carried the weight of the businessman's legacy, their own actions, however unintentional, reflecting the darkness that had plagued our town for generations. However, I started to feel a glimmer of hope. The Harbinger, though powerful, was not invincible. It was bound to the businessman's soul, and its power was derived from the fear and despair it sowed among the living. To defeat the Harbinger, I needed to break the cycle, to confront the darkness that had haunted our town for centuries. It was time to face the shadows and bring the truth to light. I shared my findings with James, who was immediately on board. Together, we decided to publish a series of articles in the local newspaper, revealing the truth about the Harbinger and the dark history it was rooted in. We hoped that by bringing the truth to light, by sharing the forgotten story of the businessman's greed and the widow's vengeful curse, we could break the Harbinger's hold on our community. We published the articles, and they created a stir in town. People were initially skeptical, but the evidence we presented, the historical records, the eyewitness accounts, the chilling patterns of the deaths, was hard to ignore. As the truth emerged, the fear began to dissipate. The Harbinger's power was weakened, its grip on our town loosened. People spoke openly about the events they had witnessed, sharing their stories, and finding solace in the collective realization that they were not alone. The town began to heal, slowly but surely. The darkness that had enveloped us for generations began to recede, replaced by a newfound sense of unity and hope. But the Harbinger was not vanquished, it was simply contained. It still lingered, a shadowy reminder of the darkness that could always return. We knew that our work was far from finished. But for the first time in a long time, we felt a sense of optimism. The truth had set us free. We had faced the shadows and emerged stronger. The Harbinger's reign of terror was over, and our town could finally begin to heal. I continued to work at the newspaper, but my role had changed. I was no longer just an editor. I was a guardian, tasked with protecting our community from the forces that lurked in the shadows. I knew that the Harbinger could return, its whispers could resurface, and its darkness could once again threaten our peace. But I also knew that we were prepared. We had confronted the truth, and we had found the strength to face whatever darkness lay ahead. The events of that night had changed me, but they also had changed my town. In the face of unimaginable horror, we had discovered a resilience, a unity, and a love for our community that had been dormant for generations. And so, we continued to live, our hearts forever marked by the darkness we had faced, but our spirits unwavering in our determination to protect the light. I was no longer just an editor. I was a guardian, a sentinel, a protector of the truth, and forever bound to the legacy of our town. Lately, every time I walk down the hallway, I get the unnerving feeling that someone's right behind me. But every time I turn around, no one's there. At night, it gets worse. I'll be lying in bed, just about to fall asleep, and suddenly, I hear something scratching across the floor. When I flick the lights on, all I see are wet patches on the wooden floorboards. I've been waking up in cold sweats, gasping for air, feeling like something is strangling me in my sleep. Sometimes I try to scream, but my voice feels stuck in my throat, like something's choking the life out of me. It's like this house itself is suffocating me. Too dark, too cold, even when it shouldn't be. When I bought this place, it was winter. The cold made sense then. Now, it feels unnatural. About a week after we moved in, my friend, Sarah, came over to visit. We were just hanging out, chatting on the couch, when suddenly she froze. Her eyes were locked on something inside the house, and without saying a word, she shot up and ran out the front door. I followed her outside, confused and asking what was wrong. All she could say was, "There's something in your house, and it's dangerous. For both you and your son. You need to get out." I pressed her for more details, but that's all she would tell me. She just kept repeating herself, her voice trembling as if she was about to break down. I knew Sarah. She wasn't the type to pull a prank like this. She had nothing to gain from scaring me. The only thing she would gain is my anger, and her losing my friendship. I tried to calm her down, assuring her that she was overreacting. "It's just an old house," I said. "It's probably just a draft or something." But she didn't buy it. The next day, when we met for coffee, she said she saw a woman, standing in the back room, staring at me. I laughed it off, told her she must have been imagining things, but she wasn't convinced. She swore the woman wasn't just staring at me, she was watching my son, Cody, too. She said the woman was dressed in a long, flowing dress, but that's all she could remember. She didn't have any more details as to what the woman looked like, and the image she had of the woman was blurry. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling. The feeling that Sarah was right. The feeling that there was something in the house, watching us. It was unnerving, and it started to consume me. Weird things kept happening. One afternoon, I took Cody out for a walk. I grabbed the car keys, but when we got to the driveway, I realized I'd forgotten something inside. I ran back in to grab it, and while I was picking up the keys, I noticed a photo of me and Cody on the wall. I swear I saw it with my own eyes. The picture flew off the wall, hit the ceiling, then shattered on the floor. Cody was outside, playing with a ball, and I was alone in the house. I couldn't have hit the picture. I wasn't even near it. It should have just dropped straight down, but no, it crashed into the ceiling first, like something had thrown it. The frame was in pieces, the photo, which was of Cody and I dressed as pirates, laying scattered on the floor. I felt chills running up my spine. The image of the photo crashing into the ceiling was ingrained in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I felt watched, and I felt vulnerable. I couldn't ignore Sarah's warnings anymore, not after that. Whatever was in the house, it wasn't happy that I had come back inside. I decided to stay home more, thinking that maybe the presence would leave us alone if we just stopped going in and out so much. I even bought a dog, a German shepherd named Jack, to keep Cody company and hopefully make me feel a little safer. But Jack didn't help. He would bark like crazy, sometimes at the ceiling, other times at random spots on the wall. It was like he was chasing something invisible. He seemed to be unsettled, and I could feel his anxiety growing stronger. He was a well-trained dog, an ex-police dog. He was used to chaos and had never been scared or fearful. And though I couldn't explain his behavior, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief that there was something here that was as scared of the presence as I was. Then, one night during a storm, things took a turn for the worse. One of those storms where it was dark as night, and the wind was howling like a wild beast. The power went out, and the house felt hotter than usual, which made no sense. We had just gotten new windows, and the house should have been well insulated. The storm made the house feel eerie, and I was getting ready to make a run for the basement when the power went out. I lit a flashlight and went to check the fuse box in the basement. Jack followed me, growling the whole way. He was usually more calm when the power went out, and this was uncharacteristic of him. But something felt off. His growls were different this time, angrier, more aggressive. As I opened the basement door, I found Jack's lifeless body lying there, but the strange thing was, I could still hear his barking, behind me. Slowly, I turned around, but there was nothing. No dog, just empty space. My heart was racing, nothing about this made sense. I had no choice but to bury Jack that night. I dug a hole in the yard, and as soon as I finished, I heard a loud crash on the roof. Then Cody's bedroom echoed with the sound of barking, loud and furious. I sprinted upstairs to check on him, terrified of what I might find. When I opened the door, Cody was asleep, completely undisturbed. And Jack? He was lying on the floor at the foot of Cody's bed, alive and well, like nothing had ever happened. The sound of the dog's barking, which was coming from the room, had abruptly stopped. I was bewildered. My legs shook as I looked out the window toward the yard. The hole I dug was still there, but Jack's body was gone. Was I losing my mind? I reached out to pet him, my hand trembling, and he responded like nothing was wrong. That's when Cody woke up, glanced behind me, and said in a trembling voice, "Dad, there's a woman standing right behind you." Jack started barking again, louder and more frantic than ever. I wanted to turn around, but I couldn't. Instead, I focused on Cody. "What is she doing, buddy?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "She's watching us. Now she's walking toward the bathroom," Cody whispered. He was staring at the hallway and watching the area intently. I mustered all the courage I had and finally turned around, but there was no one there, at least, no one I could see. I looked in the bathroom, but there wasn't anyone there. I looked around the room for any sign of some kind of shadow, but there was nothing. "Cody, are you sure you saw her?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Yes, Daddy, I saw her. She was standing there." He was staring at the doorway to the hallway. Jack started barking again, and I could feel his fear. The barking was so aggressive, it was almost as if he was trying to warn us. I looked at Cody, and his eyes were wide with fear. His eyes were fixed on the hallway. Was he imagining things? Or was there something there that I couldn't see? I decided to take Cody to my sister's house, which was just a few miles away, for the night, and I would stay in the house alone and figure out what was going on. After driving Cody to my sister's house, I returned to the house. I had a feeling that whatever was in the house, it was waiting for me. I was alone, and for the first time, I felt fear. The house seemed even darker than usual, and I could hear the wind howling outside. I locked all of the doors and went to check the windows. I felt uneasy, but I was determined to figure out what was happening. I went back to the hallway where Cody had said he saw the woman, and I stood for a long time, listening. The house was silent, except for the wind howling outside. I was alone. Whatever was in this house, it was watching me, and it seemed to be waiting for me to make a mistake. I decided to bring my sister's old record player, and I was going to play some music to try and fill some of the silence. I put the record on, and it was a peaceful song, and I could feel the music filling the house. I had to be strong. I couldn't give in to this fear. As I was putting the record on, I heard a noise in the hallway. Like a muffled thud. I turned toward the hallway, my heart skipping a beat. Was it a draft? Maybe a book fell off a shelf? I couldn't tell. I grabbed the flashlight, and as I was walking toward the hallway, I heard the noise again. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I was alone, and this house was trying to scare me. I was going to get to the bottom of this. I slowly walked down the hallway, holding the flashlight in front of me, scanning the rooms, but there was nothing there. I could feel my heart thumping in my chest, and my breathing became shallow. I was ready for whatever was in this house. I heard the noise again, and I turned toward the sound. I looked up and saw that the picture that had fallen off the wall was now back in place. I looked at the picture for a moment, then I realized it was hanging crooked. I went to fix the picture, and as I was straightening it, I heard the noise again. I stepped back and looked at the picture. It was hanging straight now. I was completely bewildered. I heard another noise, and this time I was certain it was coming from the bathroom. It was a muffled thud. I slowly walked toward the bathroom, my hand on the flashlight, ready to defend myself. I opened the door and looked inside. There was nothing there. But I could hear the sound of something hitting the floor. I had to find out what it was. I walked into the bathroom and went to check behind the shower curtain. It was so dark, I could barely see, but I could hear the sound of something hitting the floor, and I was determined to find out what it was. I yanked the shower curtain back. There was nothing there. I looked up and saw that the curtain was hung up crooked. It looked like someone had tried to pull the curtain back. I was starting to feel dizzy. I didn't understand what was going on. I walked out of the bathroom and back to the hallway. I was alone. I went to the front door and looked outside. It was a dark night, and the wind was howling outside. I could see the shadows of the trees dancing in the wind. I knew I needed to get out of this house. I was alone, and I felt like I was being watched. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I knew I had to get out. I ran to my car, and I got in and locked the doors. I started the car and drove away as fast as I could. I needed to get away. I drove for hours, not knowing where I was going. I just needed to get away from that house. I finally stopped at a motel, and I checked in. I went to my room and closed the door behind me. I was so tired, but I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that house. I kept thinking about the woman, about the picture, about Jack. I couldn't understand what was happening. The next morning, I got up and went to the office. I had to call someone. Had to get some help. I had to find out what was going on. I called Sarah, and I told her everything that had happened. I told her about the picture, the woman, Jack. She listened patiently, but I could tell she was scared. She said she didn't know what to do. She suggested I call a priest, but I didn't know any priests. I called my sister, and I told her everything that had happened. She was scared too. She said I should move out of the house. She suggested I call a realtor. But I didn't want to move out. I had just bought the house, and I had so many dreams for the house and for my family. I had to try to save it. I called a realtor, and I made an appointment to meet with him the next day. I decided to return to the house the next day when the realtor was coming to take a look at it. But as I was driving towards the house, something happened. I could see the house in the distance, and it looked different. It looked as if there was a dark cloud hanging over it. I suddenly felt nauseous, and I felt as if the air had gotten really heavy. I was almost choking on it. I could feel my heart beating fast. I pulled over to the side of the road and stopped the car. I put my head between my knees, and I started to breathe deeply. I had to calm down. I didn't know why I felt so scared. I had been feeling like this for a while. I had a bad feeling, but I didn't know what it was. I decided to go to the house anyway. I needed to find out what was going on. The realtor was already there when I arrived. I could tell he was hesitant as he was walking through the house, and he kept looking back over his shoulder. I showed him the bathroom and the hallway where I had heard the noises, and he looked at me with a strange look on his face. He said he knew that my dog had died, but he said that he had heard a dog barking. I looked at him, and I could tell he was scared too. I thought I was alone. I thought I was the only one who was being haunted. But I was wrong. I called a priest that night. He was hesitant at first but agreed to come the next day to bless the house. I don't know why I called him, but I knew I had to do something. The priest came the next day, and he walked through the house, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers. He said that the house was haunted, and that he had felt something evil inside the house. He blessed the house and told me to keep the windows and doors locked at all times and to pray for protection. I did what the priest asked, and for a while things were quiet. I didn't hear any more noises, and I didn't feel as scared. I started to think that maybe the priest had done something to help. But then one morning I woke up, and I heard a noise. It was a scraping sound, coming from downstairs. I froze. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I thought it was over. I grabbed my flashlight and ran downstairs. I looked around the house, but I couldn't find anything. I was alone. But then I heard the noise again. It was coming from the basement. I slowly walked toward the basement door, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I took a deep breath and opened the door. It was dark inside the basement. The air was cold and damp. I couldn't see anything. I held my breath and listened. I heard the noise again. It was coming from the far end of the basement. The noise was getting louder. I took a step into the basement, and I could feel the cold air hitting my face. I could feel the cold air seeping into my lungs. I was scared. I walked toward the sound, my flashlight beam sweeping across the basement floor. I could hear the sound of something scraping on the floor, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I was afraid, but I knew I had to find out what was making that noise. I had to find out what was in my basement. I reached the far end of the basement, and I shined my flashlight beam across the wall. And there it was. A figure, standing in the shadows. It was the woman. She was tall and thin, and she was dressed in a long, flowing dress. She had long black hair, and her eyes were as dark as night. She looked at me, and her eyes seemed to bore into my soul. I screamed, and I dropped my flashlight. The woman turned and walked away. I stood there, frozen in terror, watching her disappear into the shadows. I've been living in my sister's house ever since that night. I'm still trying to figure out what happened to me. I'm still trying to figure out what happened to my house. But I know one thing for sure. That house is haunted. And it is not safe. I met a writer named Mike Carson at a literary festival in the city. He was a tall, lanky man with a shock of unruly brown hair and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 stories. He didn't just scribble down ghost stories. His tales carried a weight of truth that you could feel in your bones. They weren't just about spooky happenings, but about the dark corners of human nature, the lingering echoes of sorrow, and the whispers of the beyond that seeped into our lives. I remember being drawn to his booth, captivated by the cover of his latest book, Whispers from the Edge. It depicted a lone figure walking across a desolate beach, the setting sun casting long shadows that stretched towards a swirling vortex in the sky. It was an image that stayed with me long after I'd left the festival. We talked for a while, discussing the craft of writing and the power of stories. He told me he'd been writing since he was a child, but lately, he felt like his creativity was stagnating. He was tired of the city, of the constant noise and bustle, and the stories he'd been trying to write felt hollow, devoid of the raw energy that had always fueled his writing. "I need a change," he said, his voice raspy. "Something to shake things up, to get the dust off my soul." That's when he told me about his plan. He was moving to a small coastal town, a place where the ocean waves crashed against the shore, and the air was filled with the scent of salt and sea. He'd heard about an old, abandoned property on the outskirts of town, a place whispered to be haunted. He was drawn to the mystery, the potential for stories that would reach deeper than anything he'd ever written before. I watched him go, fascinated by his ambition. He was chasing a ghost, literally and metaphorically, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this whole endeavor was going to be more than just a story. Months later, I got a postcard from Mike. It was a simple, handwritten note, accompanied by a grainy photograph of an old, weather-beaten house perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. The waves crashed below, a white curtain of foam against the dark gray rock. He wrote about the peacefulness of the ocean, about the calming rhythm of the waves, and how the air felt different, filled with a kind of energy he hadn't felt in years. "It's like the ocean is breathing life back into me," he wrote. "I feel like I'm finally getting somewhere with the story. I'm writing a book about this town, about the local tribes, about how a simple human life can change in an instant when spirits cross into our world. It was intriguing, a new direction for his stories. He also talked about a cafe he'd found, called Billy's Brew, where he would often spend hours writing on the back balcony, overlooking the sea. He told me about his new book, which centered around a local legend. He had imagined a scenario where a circle of candles surrounded a mirror, and if you had the right photo hanging above it, you could summon a soul from the other side. He described it as a simple ritual, a way to connect with the departed, but one that carried a dangerous element. It felt haunting, almost prophetic, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as I read his words. Time passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to see Mike, to understand what was happening to him, to see if those whispers he was writing about had begun to seep into his own reality. I packed a bag and drove to the coastal town, determined to find him. The town was small, a cluster of houses clinging to the cliffs, with a single main street lined with quaint shops and cafes. I found Billy's Brew easily, a charming little place with a bright blue paint job and a cozy interior. The barista, a young woman with a warm smile and a friendly demeanor, told me that Mike lived in a place called Old Dunes Manor, a dilapidated house on the edge of town. It's said to be haunted, she added, but Mike seemed to find it inspirational. The drive out to Old Dunes Manor was a little eerie. The road snaked around the cliffs, offering breathtaking views of the ocean but also revealing a growing sense of isolation. The house stood at the very edge of the cliff, silhouetted against the setting sun. It looked as if it had been abandoned for years, the paint peeling, the windows boarded up. I parked down the road, taking a deep breath before approaching the house. It was a strange feeling walking up to the front door. The air felt thick and heavy, like a shroud of sadness had settled over the place. I knocked on the door, expecting to hear the sound of my fist against wood, but instead, it was a hollow, echoing thud. I called Mike's name, but there was no answer. I turned the handle, expecting it to be locked, but it opened with a rusty groan. I stepped inside, the air immediately turning stale and cold, like the house had been holding its breath for years. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below. I walked through the house, each room a testament to a life turned upside down. A bookcase crammed with books, the pages yellowed with age, a dusty easel with brushes scattered on the floor, a half-written manuscript left abandoned on a desk. It was as if Mike had simply walked out of the house, leaving everything behind, as if he had been swept away by the very stories he was writing. As I explored the house, a strange feeling began to creep over me, a sense of unease that grew with every step. I felt as if I was being watched, as if something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to leave. I stopped at the top of the stairs, feeling the weight of the silence press down upon me. I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper, like a voice carried on the wind. I looked around, my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't see anything. I started to feel afraid, the kind of fear that comes from knowing you are not alone, that you are being observed by something you cannot see. I decided to leave, to get out of that house, to escape the feeling of being watched. As I turned to go, I felt a cold hand grip my arm, squeezing tightly. I screamed, whirling around to see who or what was holding me. But there was nothing there. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I ran, stumbling out of the house, the cold air stinging my lungs as I fled down the path. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my body trembling with fear. I threw the car door open, slammed it shut, and sped away from the house, leaving it behind in the darkness. I drove all night, fueled by the adrenaline in my veins, until the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the horizon. I stopped for coffee, trying to calm my nerves, trying to make sense of what had happened. But I couldn't. The incident at Old Dunes Manor haunted my dreams, the chilling touch of that unseen hand imprinted on my memory. I tried to rationalize it, to explain it away, but I couldn't. Something had happened in that house, something that had left me shaken to my core. I knew I had to find Mike, to find out what had happened to him, to understand what had driven him to that isolated house, to those dark stories. I drove back to Billy's Brew, hoping he might be there, but the barista told me he hadn't been seen in weeks. "He's just vanished," she said, her voice filled with concern. "He left all his belongings at the house, but he's just gone." I left the cafe, feeling lost and desperate. I drove back to Old Dunes Manor, determined to find some clue as to what had happened to Mike. I stood at the doorway, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. The door creaked open, inviting me in. This time, instead of fear, I felt a strange sense of inevitability, as if I were being drawn into a vortex of stories, a narrative I couldn't escape. I stepped inside, the air feeling more oppressive this time, a suffocating blanket of sorrow that pressed against my chest. The silence was louder this time, the house filled with a stillness that was almost tangible, as if it were waiting, holding its breath. I walked through the rooms, the shadows stretching long and thin in the fading light, the silence broken only by the crashing waves below. I reached the library, drawn by the silent allure of countless stories. The shelves were crammed with books, spines pressed together, their titles whispering secrets. I ran my fingers over the worn leather covers, feeling the weight of history, the stories that had been told, the stories that were yet to be written. As I explored the library, I noticed a small, wooden box tucked away on the top shelf. It was an antique box, ornately carved with symbols I couldn't recognize. I lifted the lid, revealing a single sheet of paper inside. It was an unfinished manuscript, written in Mike's hand. The words were written in a frantic scrawl, the ink smudged and blotted, as if he had been writing in a hurry, as if something was chasing him. The manuscript was titled, "The Ritual." It was a chilling story about a young man who had been obsessed with the idea of summoning spirits, who had become convinced that he could communicate with the dead. He had performed the ritual that Mike had described in his postcard, the candlelit circle, the mirror, the photograph. And he had succeeded. The young man had called forth a spirit, but the spirit had not come in peace. It had come with a hunger, with a thirst for revenge. It had sought him out, wanting to claim him, to take him back to the other side. The young man had run, but the spirit had pursued him, its presence growing stronger with each passing moment. The manuscript ended abruptly, the last words written in a desperate plea. "I don't know what to do. I can't escape it. It's everywhere, all around me. Help." I dropped the page as if it had burned my hand. The air in the room felt cold, the silence heavy, and I could feel a presence near me, unseen but palpable. I looked up, my heart pounding in my chest, my eyes scanning the shadows, but there was nothing there. I ran out of the house, out of the darkness, back to the car, fueled by the adrenaline of fear and confusion. As I drove away from Old Dunes Manor, I could feel the weight of the stories on my shoulders, the whispers of the beyond following me. I knew that I had to find Mike, that his safety was at stake. I had to find some way to warn him, to help him escape the darkness he had so carelessly invited into his life. I knew I had to chase those whispers, to learn the stories that remained untold, to uncover the truth behind the tales. I could no longer ignore the whispers. I had to follow them. I had become part of the story. And I was scared.